So, if you're a regular to my channel, you were probably expecting to hear what made me cranky about Captain Marvel in time to know whether or not you should go see it. Unfortunately, life has been kicking my ass for a few months, so I didn't get to make that video or the ones for a number of other major releases I would normally have covered. Maybe I need to set up a Patreon or something so I can get paid for this stuff. Anyway, now that I missed the window to give it a proper review and it went on to make a bunch of money despite its numerous problems, I figured what I'd do instead is take a page from Nando v. Movies' book and talk about how we could fix Captain Marvel with one relatively small change. If you haven't seen his channel, it's really good, and I'll leave a link in the description so you can see how some minor changes can completely recontextualize a lot of the movies you've heard me complain about before. Of course, before we can talk about how to fix the movie, we have to actually know what's wrong with it, so let's briefly cover what did make me cranky about Captain Marvel. Please note, this is your one and only spoiler warning. Anyway, so like most people, the thing that made me the crankiest about Captain Marvel was the emasculation of Nick Fury and the other retcons of the MCU timeline. That kind of thing is one of the biggest Achilles heels of doing prequels because it's exceedingly rare a movie can deliver anything as epic as whatever version we've all conjured up in our imaginations. But Captain Marvel's writers weren't content with merely failing to live up to your expectations. They actually went out of the way to turn things into gags, which means even scenes in previous movies have been ruined by extension. For example, when watching Captain America: The Winter Soldier, you're made to believe that something happened to Nick Fury that fundamentally changed how he looked at the world, quite literally in this case. And so, his perspective on that whole helicarrier thing had a justification on par with Steve Rogers' argument. But thanks to Captain Marvel, we know that's a lie. He just got scratched by a cat. So his entire motivation goes out the window and everything he said was just bullshit. All the way to that scene is now gone. Thing is, though, as irritating as it is to have all of the mystery and menace sucked out of Nick Fury by the boring, bland black hole of charisma that is Carol Danvers in her movie, removing that stuff wouldn't change much about Captain Marvel itself, because if those scenes weren't tied to the larger context of the MCU, they really wouldn't be that much of a problem. They'd just be gags that don't land, and most movies can survive a few of those. The real problem with Captain Marvel is that Carol Danvers is not a hero. She's a her-o, which is what I think I'm going to start calling all of these feminist Mary Sue inserts as a fun way to use their own marketing lingo against them. In other words, Carol Danvers, who never actually gets called Captain Marvel by the way, has no arc whatsoever. Just like all of these other her-os, she comes fully formed with everything she needs to succeed all the time, and everyone around her is either far less competent than she is, or too busy praising her skills to do the job themselves, and sometimes both. Sure, there's always lip service paid to faults and failures that the her-o supposedly has, so that people inclined to defend these badly written movies have something to hang their hat on. But these failings are either the kind that make her more sympathetic, think putting "I'm a workaholic" as a self-criticism on a job application, or they're simply not borne out by what we're actually shown about the character. For instance, we're told a few times that Carol's problem is that she can't control her emotions. But you couldn't tell that from Brie Larson's constant look of mild disappointment, or what we see Carol actually do. There's no point at which she flies into a rage and blasts somebody she shouldn't. There's no fight where her opponent baits her into defeat by provoking her in some way, or a moment where she has an emotional breakdown of some sort. Indeed, there is nothing she ever fails to do because she's overcome with some kind of emotion, be it fear, sadness, anger, or what have you. Because a hero can't fail. Then they wouldn't be a good role model for little girls. I could make a whole video about how this is actually a terrible example for little girls, but that's beside the point here. So the main thing we have to fix in order to make Captain Marvel work is to give Carol Danvers a problem she can't overcome unless she grows as a character, and I think the solution can be found by looking at a scene at the very end of the movie. In their final confrontation, Jude Law's character tries to goad Carol Danvers into fighting him hand-to-hand without her powers because he knows he's pretty screwed otherwise. It's an incredibly transparent move, and in any other movie, Carol would fight him anyway and best him to demonstrate how far she's come as a character. Instead, Captain Marvel decides to pull an Indiana Jones by just having her blast him, which would be a great subversion of expectations and a wonderful moment for the character, were it not for the line that comes immediately after. Carol says that she has nothing to prove to him. Except that we've never seen her try to prove anything to anyone. And the only other time we've ever watched them fight, she blasted him out of spite, so it's not even like she wouldn't normally do that. In fact, she spends the whole movie basically doing whatever she wants, regardless of what anyone else says or does. The closest we get to her trying to prove things are the brief snippets of flashbacks to the part of her life that she doesn't even remember, in which she just keeps standing up after getting hurt doing something someone told her she couldn't do. Because nobody gets to tell Carol what to do. Like I said earlier, she hasn't changed at all. So how do we fix this? How do we give Carol Danvers a satisfying arc without having to completely rewrite the entire movie? Well, I think the answer is that Carol Danvers should have a serious case of Marty McFly syndrome.
What's wrong, McFly? Chicken?
What did you call me, Griff?
Chicken! McFly!
Nobody calls me chicken.
Essentially, she should be an incredibly insecure character who is always out to prove something, even when doing so would be completely to her own detriment. As a result, she's often goaded into doing stupid things that end up getting her hurt. And we can start with that right at the very beginning with her little sparring session with Jude Law, who I think is called Jan Rog, but Jude Law is just easier to say, so I'm just going to go with that. In the original version, Jude Law spends the fight trying to teach her to control her emotions and her powers as a result, but in my version, it should be the opposite. It should be Veers, as she's known to them, who is refusing to use her powers because she insists she can beat him fair and square. His lesson is that there is no fair and square in combat, and that her ego will only get her hurt. He's got superior strength and significantly more experience than she does, so she should use every advantage that she has to beat him. The other minor change to that scene is that they won't be alone. A couple of her other teammates would wander in during the fight, and they'll provide a little exposition for us, namely that Carol's been routinely challenging Jude Law to this fight, trying to prove she can win without her powers. The fight goes on pretty much exactly as it did, with Jude Law dominating her and Carol briefly getting angry and charging up her fist. Only in this version, Jude Law smiles, and says something to the effect of, "Good, use it." And when she refuses, Jude Law puts her down hard. "You could have won that fight," he says. "One shot and I'd be lying on the floor over there. Instead, you have a broken arm." And rather than standing there for her to petulantly shoot him afterwards, he just walks away, and her teammate snarks, "Told you couldn't beat him." Afterwards, she still goes to visit the Supreme Intelligence, which, rather than chiding her, is almost motherly, supporting her decision by saying her powers are a gift not meant to be abused. It's similar to the threat about how they can be taken away, because as we find out later, they're actually inhibiting the ability she got from the explosion, but it gives us, the audience, a reason to think that she really trusts these Kree people. The rest of the movie plays out very similarly to how it did before, only instead of her memory flashes being about standing up after getting knocked down, we start to see additional context each time we see the flashback that reveals they were not what they seemed at first. So her dad wasn't some drunken hillbilly who thought girls can't race. He was actually trying to protect her from herself. She was goaded into racing by two bullies who had every intent of just running her off the track. Her dad knew their type and tried to warn her, and his "I told you so" comes with his helping her back up. The cart's also wrecked, so now he has to figure out how to pay for that, and they're down on their luck, and so that's actually a really big deal. Essentially, Carol doesn't get to race anymore at all because they're not going to be able to fix the thing. Then during basic training, we see that a super ripped dude does the rope jump first, so Carol isn't just trying to do this on her own accord. She's actually been dared into doing the same thing. Her drill instructor is trying to warn her that she's not actually physically strong enough to do that, but Carol does it anyway and breaks her arm. Good job, Danvers, you just washed yourself out. Now you're gonna have to start all over again. The bit about "you know why they call it a cockpit" turns out not to be a sexist joke because it's followed up by "because pilots always turn out to be pricks," in reference to Carol having just ruined some event by getting into a fight. And lastly, we see the one with Mar-Vell, who told her to run because she did not know what she was getting into. Carol, ever refusing good advice, didn't, which led to her becoming a Kree pawn and missing out on all that time with her friends. So over the course of the movie, what we're realizing is that Carol has some serious regrets about the way she's acted because of how it ultimately cost her the life she knew. And so the only other thing we really have to change to line up with this is the speech from her friend Maria, who does go on to list all of Carol's great qualities, but she also points out that she's always had a chip on her shoulder. It was that chip that got her to fly the mission with Mar-Vell, and it's that chip that's going to get her killed confronting Jude Law and the Supreme Intelligence when she could just walk away. Because she's really not going to fight them out of altruism, she's going because she's pissed off at being lied to. And then the moment of truth comes, where Jude Law has pushed that button as hard as he can, and for the first time ever, she doesn't rise to the bait. She just blasts him and walks off, saying she's got nothing to prove. Now, it won't do anything about Brie Larson's acting, the lackluster direction, or the painful retcons, but at least then Carol Danvers will have actually changed over the course of the movie. I also think it would make her a much more interesting character coming into Endgame, since that's going to bring her face to face with characters like Tony Stark, who live to push people's buttons. So instead of her just being an OP Thanos punching machine, she'd be a wild card that could end up being as much of a problem for the Avengers as a solution, because if somebody like Tony pushes the right button, she could end up fighting them instead of Thanos, you know? Anyway, that's my thoughts on how we could fix Captain Marvel. What do you think of the changes? Let me know in the comments below, and if you want a more detailed review of Captain Marvel, you can check out the podcast I do with a good friend of mine called The Flyby, which I'll leave a link for in the description as well. Coming up next, I'll have a review of the other Captain Marvel from DC, aka Shazam, so make sure to subscribe to the channel so you know when that comes out. Hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time.